Okay, so thanks for inviting me. It's obviously nice to be here because it's always nice to speak to new people and just sort of share some thoughts I have. I'll tell you a bit about One Nucleus because I'm hoping in that sense it will possibly show us where there's opportunities to collaborate and support, and what could we do to help. I guess why would you be interested in me? And I guess I've come at this. I have a perspective I've brought to it, and I'll share some of that, why I'm interested. But also, it's left me with a lot of questions, and I guess I'll come on to those questions a little bit later as we go through. No, it's not going to go down. I'll try this one. So with that one, like I said, I guess everybody always brings their own perspective to any particular topic, and mine's been shaped by my career and I guess more latterly by experience with my family, albeit peripheral to some of that. And then maybe as we get into some discussion after, just about what we can do to build collaborations and engage all stakeholders, and some thoughts around that. This bit always strikes me in a sense that comes down to communication most of the time, is how do we best build trust? I think if I flip this into the context of what's been going on with COVID-19, even when you see people uncertain about do they trust the scientific data or do they trust the vaccines and what's going on, a lot of that is about how we communicate and engage with people. And then what can we do together, maybe. So I thought I'd take you on a little bit of a journey, if I may, for just a few minutes to explain how I got to where I am. And that's what shaped me. So in the top left, I started life as a farmer's boy on a Welsh hill farm, more years ago now than I can probably remember in reality with any great detail. But from that was a background where my dad had farmed all his life, and that was what was in our family. And I had siblings who went off to be bricklayers and hairdressers and what have you. And I was the first one out of that group to say, well, actually, you know what, I'm interested in medical research and science. So I ended up taking my step across to the next chain, which I ended up going to university in Cardiff to study biochemistry. And the more I studied it, the more I had questions and was curious, I guess, about what could be done, the advances being made in medicine and understanding different diseases and disorders, and actually what could be done to help. And from Cardiff, I then went and did my PhD in Southampton. Before the map in the top right, actually, I'm not expecting you to read any of this. It's a map of the Western General Hospital in Edinburgh. And I got a job there after my PhD, discovering cancer drugs, actually nothing to do with neuroscience at that point. And this was all about how do you discover new molecules and compounds you can use to treat people and get better outcomes for patients, which was the driver for myself. You really wanted to help improve things. It wasn't just a scientific curiosity, you wanted an outcome. And that was the same for the people around me. And I wanted to highlight the Edinburgh bit because it was in those days it was called the Imperial Cancer Research Fund, but it's now all part of Cancer Research UK. But we used to go out from the labs, and we were working out to the shops, the charity shops, and to talk to the volunteers and explain to them what we'd been doing with the money they were diligently raising. And I think that was my first exposure at that point to actually engaging with people who'd been directly affected by a disorder and disease that I was involved in researching. And as much as I was passionate about science and wanted things to work, that was the first time you felt the real energy of somebody looking at it from a patient's perspective. And having spent nearly 4 years doing research in Edinburgh, I was offered a job to come back down to London with the Medical Research Council, but that wasn't in the laboratory anymore. This was moving into something which is called technology transfer. And do interrupt me if I'm covering things you already know, I guess. But the technology transfer was about working with scientists, identifying what their inventions were, and looking to work with industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, to help develop those ideas and inventions through into new products and doing the rest of the chain. And I did that both with the Medical Research Council to start with, and then I moved to the red building in the middle square there, which is the Cruciform building on Gower Street in London. Now, the Cruciform building many years ago was the North London Hospital, centuries ago. And it got into quite a bit of disrepair, and the Wellcome Trust and other benefactors paid the money to restore the building to its glory. And they do open houses now and again. If anybody wants to go and look around a stunning building in London, the Cruciform building is quite stunning. I really enjoyed working in there. They turned the inside into a modern medical school and research laboratories, but maintained the external facade. And again, that was the point where you started to realize they'd uncovered these big murals on the wall. Sorry, they weren't murals, they were Dalton China tiles, colored tiles of nursery rhymes, 4 6-foot by 4-foot tiles to about 4 different nursery rhymes. And they uncovered them under the plaster on the wall during the renovation. And the reason they were in that particular wing of the building was that was the children's ward in the old hospital. And as you got into the history of it, and then they used to do these open days, once again, you started to see that really strong connection between some of the benefactors who'd left. And it doesn't sound much now, but they'd left, you know, £350 to the hospital trust to help support research and patient care. But they left this back in the 1800s. So these were significant contributions at the time. So I carried on doing my working with researchers and working with industry. We got into starting new companies, which were very innovative and tried to do things in a way that they could then sell on at a further development stage to the pharma industry. And then somebody in a group called London First, who are a lobby group in London, we'd created amongst a group of friends of ours, or colleagues, I should not friends, something called the London Biotechnology Network, to try and give a focus to all of us people doing similar things in London, in terms of growing companies and translating research. And the people who were the custodians of this gave me a call and said, do you want to come and run this network of companies? And they were across all disciplines. And by this stage, I was spending a lot of time helping researchers commercialize things that were in the neuroscience field. So I'd gone out of oncology to some degree and cancer, but into neuroscience, learning more about dementia, learning more about spinal repair, learning more about Parkinson's disease, but only, I guess at that point, still at quite a scientific level, not a direct exposure. And then quite recently, relatively speaking, it's only been 2 or 3 years, I happened to meet somebody at a conference who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in their 30s. And they were running something called Parkinson's Concierge to try and raise awareness of the condition, the symptoms, and what employers could do to help support them, and people with Parkinson's disease. And it was, I think the guy phrased it saying, it's great, there's lots of research looking for a cure, which is where my focus had been, and the researchers I've worked with. But actually, if that's not coming quick enough, we've got to live with Parkinson's. And I'm sure you guys are far more expert than I am, so I'm not going to go down that. But it was something that really resonated with me. But then the more I started learning about just the variety of symptoms that comes with Parkinson's, I'd seen, if you like, the stereotypical, the reported and the obvious symptoms, I guess, that people associate generally. But I started reflecting on, with respect to my own father, because he'd worked on his farm, you know, as a child and from the age of 15 when he left school. And back in those days, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there weren't half the controls you had now around exposure to insecticides in sheep dip and spraying crops. And my dad was a very keen darts player at quite a good level. But he got into his mid-60s, and he had something which at the time was called dartitis. And it basically meant he couldn't let go of the dart when he was trying to throw the dart at the board. And he started to get tremor. And then he had some mental health issues, and he passed away 10, 12 years ago now. But the more I've engaged with people suffering with Parkinson's disease, I guess, and the reason I know Russ and Charlotte at the Concierge, and the more I've read around it, I've started to question, and he found it very difficult. They couldn't really say what was wrong. And then I was starting to hear the fact that even now, diagnosing Parkinson's disease can take some time. And there's quite a lot of delays in getting to see specialists and so forth. And I started my mind going back, thinking, well, maybe this is what my dad had all along. It wasn't just getting older, or was it to do with he inhaled, I don't know, he had farmer's lung at one point from working in dust, and he was quite a heavy smoker at one stage. But a lot of it and I don't know, I'll never know whether it was Parkinson's disease that was causing his tremor, or his mental health problems, or other. But then it sort of became a little bit closer to home when my brother-in-law has been diagnosed with Parkinson's since, and started with how long it took him to get a diagnosis of this. So I guess my interest in Parkinson's disease, as I say, I've not experienced it, and I've never walked in the shoes of patients, obviously, but you started to appreciate some of the things that are challenges, and some of the things we could perhaps do better as society. And certainly from the sector I'm in, it was really about, were there things that I could do that meant there was active dialogue, there was support, and there were things that made a difference. So I've always been interested in people, which is part of why I do the role now, because I'll tell you a bit more about One Nucleus later. And there was this serendipity within the family and through contacts. But I'm conscious I've been guilty of making assumptions, or just being ill-informed or unaware, and maybe not communicating effectively with all stakeholders. I've been working with the people I work with in our sector. Had I really worked hard enough to understand communication wider than that? And then increasingly, and that idea that communication underlies building of trust. And I think that's really important in this sector that I work in, of anywhere, because you have to have trust before you can change behaviors. And if you want better outcomes, sometimes it's behaviors that have to change in various quarters. And that's left me with a load of questions, as I mentioned. So questions for me really could be summarized of, how do we do it better? Whether that's, companies talk a lot about being patient-centric and patient-friendly. Is that real? Are they really involving patients in what they do? Because the assumptions I was thinking, looking back on, it wasn't in Parkinson's disease, it was actually in spinal repair. And I was working with a researcher who got a new technique to try and repair spinal damage after people have had accidents or other injuries to their spine. And he was sort of explaining what he does and where they focus. And he was sponsored by Christopher Reeve, the guy who played Superman. And we got talking about what was priority for patients as opposed to what we could do scientifically. And he was telling me, this was a senior professor then nearing the end of his career. And he said the one lesson he learned was never assume what's important to patients just because it's important to scientists. And what are the things that patients prioritize over wanting treatments for, and how the treatments work compared to what, because we can do it technically doesn't mean it's challenging the main or the top priority. Because, for me, I'd always naively assumed someone who had an accident was in a wheelchair, they wanted to be able to walk again. You said actually when you spoke to the patients, what they were telling him was there were other things that they wanted, like sometimes they'd lost bladder control, they wanted those sort of things back, or they'd lost some of their communication skills. So it really wasn't right to be assuming, you're not walking in those people's shoes. And then I was discussing this with someone who was leading research at the Alzheimer's Research UK a few years back. And he was reflecting a similar thing where he felt they were only just beginning to understand the nature of that interaction. So I guess I was left with these questions of, how do we truly engage patients? How do we become better employers? Just because there is this diversity, the neurodiversity session I was talking earlier with a group of our member companies and colleagues and people suffering with Parkinson's disease. And it was a case of, there's this thing where employers aren't quite sure how to support a Parkinson's disease patient because the symptoms are so varied and they can vary from day to day in terms of how people feel. So how do we become better at supporting that Parkinson's disease patients to work and be in the workplace? And actually, I think the better we get at these things, the better we can actually inform career choices of new generations of talent coming through, if they want to make a difference, and what are the values that we have as a collectively as an employer in the life science research sector, then those values can align and really motivate high quality staff and researchers and the people who support them. So I was left with, how do we do it better? And then I was thinking, well, why would I be interesting to you? And I may not be, so I'm not going to prejudge this. I'm just thinking he's a reason I might be. So what can I help with? Well, we have a strong platform as One Nucleus, so we can keep raising awareness and we can keep bringing issues up and trying to give a voice to some of what you do. I mean, you have a great platform, obviously, with Parkinson's UK, but sometimes it's nice to get to a different network. I think engaging and communicating more, what can we do, like I say, to help companies in this space be truly patient-centric and informed about what needs you actually need meeting. And how do we use these platforms to create that trust and therefore influence? So whether that's on policy making, whether it's on investment decisions in research and development programs, or indeed in treatments when they become available. But I think the latest Parkinson's disease treatment, as such as a chemical entity, as I recall, is 40 or 50 years ago that was invented. So there's still some work to go. And then from a practical level, if that awareness helps bring funding in, maybe buying lots of copies of your lovely book. You know, it's what can we do that actually means energy and funding go into this system with that communication. How can we better align the research that goes on with the unmet need that's there? How do we enable employers? If we can inform them, they can be more inclusive. And I think it's not letting them shy away because they don't feel informed enough to know how to support a Parkinson's patient in the workplace, because it's, you know, these things are a scale. And then the really practical bit for me is attracting the best talent into supporting all of those efforts in whatever role and skills people have. So why do I think we have the platform? This is a bit of background about One Nucleus, which I don't know why the notes are showing up on the end, but ignore the left-hand scribbles, these are drafting. Basically, it was to say we've got somewhere in the region of 450 member companies. So we're a not-for-profit organization. We're funded by member subscription. They pay their annual fees, and that's what allows us to pay our bills. There's 10 of us in the office. And we engage all of those types of companies on the right-hand side. So they're doing primary research and looking for new treatment targets, new interventions, new technologies. We have some that provide services to those companies, academia and universities researching, investors, private investors, as well as government grant funding bodies who want to support this research across, and this is across all life sciences and human healthcare. This isn't just about Parkinson's, but also the professional services like lawyers and intellectual property and consultancies and business development and deal making, all of those services, those who provide the laboratories. And I've seemed to have got two lots of professional services. Okay, clearly wasn't looking straight when I was doing this one. And then they're spread mainly across Cambridge and London, others in parts of the UK, and then we have a lot of international links. So it's a big group of people, all with a common cause to improve healthcare outcomes. And they're all motivated by this. And I don't think I come across anyone in our sector who isn't motivated by wanting to see this, whatever they're researching or deal they're working on, translate to patient benefit. And then for One Nucleus, the activities we do. So we do a number of events with our members, ranging from small roundtable type discussions or virtual roundtables at the current time, to large conferences with 700 people at talking about these topics. And I tend to focus our company's activity into those four areas. And tonight I was just going to highlight, we focus around people. So that's training courses, learning and development. We support recruitment and how to be good employers, and we do newsletters. But I've highlighted the fact that we now outwardly want to engage patient and research charity groups, because believe it or not, even though the sector we're in, that was never formally, we always did it, we just never formally read as a strategy. So now we go out to groups like yourselves, if it's of interest, and we offer you free membership of One Nucleus so that you can post news, you can keep raising awareness and engage in our events. So again, that may be one practical step that some of the group may feel useful, that it provides another avenue to raise awareness and support. Because the thing often, again, something came up earlier in the session I was doing today, was about some of the symptoms of Parkinson's. There are technologies out there, but maybe those companies just aren't aware of the fact that Parkinson's disease patients would benefit from them. So they've never thought about it. So again, that's things maybe ready and waiting if we get the message to the right people. And then we do a lot to promote our members and the East of England and London corridor region. We do an annual review, and again, these are things I'm more than happy to work with the group. If there's an article you'd like to put in the review or onto our website, then more than happy to do that. And actually, one of the things I can do almost immediately tomorrow, if you send me a link to it, I can promote the fact that you're selling your book, because that will be interesting for people. And if that shows they can engage and help at the same time, then that's brilliant. These are some of the events we do, how people engage with us. The two big conferences are on Helix and Genesis. I've left the old dates on just because the other ones are coming down the track. And then we have these smaller meetings. And we have something called Bio Wednesday, which is a networking session. They're all online now, and they will stay there. And again, it's just people talking about what's going on in our industry and raising issues and getting to meet other people. And that's kind of where I've got to know the Parkinson's concierge people, which has ended up in today's session. Then we go out and exhibit at various conferences, and again, we take literature, we sit on panels or moderate them. This is a panel I happened to be moderating about 18 months ago. And again, it's just opportunities to keep raising key issues, keep informing our audience. And this is a slide at the end that I always use with our team internally. This isn't an external one as such. But I think there's always that thing where we have all these people networking with us. We engage with fantastic groups, and increasingly so, and that's part of the joy of learning. But I always try and get them to envisage the fact that rather than being part of, and we often talk about this word ecosystem in my world of connecting and networking companies, there's all these bits of the jigsaw to help people make things better. So this whole ecosystem goes on. But actually, I've always thought, this is what I tell the team, it's basically about people, money, and technology. And we're in a very privileged position as One Nucleus to be able to connect hundreds, if not thousands, of people doing just that. They're bringing one or more of those elements. I always get them to think about the shard, thinking, well, what would we fill the shard with if we were just One Nucleus? And those are the key areas we would go through. And that's what I try and get with. Well, I don't get them to aspire to moving into the shard. I don't ever see that's a dream, not a reality. But I think it's about trying to make sure all the time, even within our own team, we're focused on the fact that there isn't just one little corner of this that we can try and bring together. It's cross-discipline and it's cross-groups. And how do we communicate with all of those stakeholders? How do we communicate better? What is it you'd like us to communicate to you from our sector? What would be useful? And what would you like us to communicate back to our contacts? So I guess that was all I wanted to say. So that's why I come at it this way. I don't have any expertise in Parkinson's disease. Yes, I've got an interest in it, and more so the more I learn. And it fascinates me in the sense that I think some of the great work that goes on, and not just great work in research that I'm closer to, the great work that goes on by people like yourselves, supporting each other as a community, but also raising that awareness and how anyone else can engage. So I guess that was it really from me. My questions are, how do we do it better? And perhaps we could spend the rest of the time just saying, well, this is what you think I could do that's useful. And I'll try and put it into context of what I do day in, day out. So thank you for your attention, I guess. We'll leave it there. Oh, sorry, I'd missed the chat box about going into present. Sorry, Simon.
So I think that's really interesting because it's about people, and I'm always interested in people. So can I just kick off by saying what could we do as a branch to help you get more interest from scientists?
I guess, what would be great in the sense is opportunities where, one of the group just comes and speaks to our events if we've got them going. I think Lucy was at the one this morning we did, and you'll get a feel for the kind of interaction it is. Because I think there's nothing more compelling to say this is what we need to change or what we can do to help than hearing someone from your group that deals with this all the time and knows what people need. And I think it's just to encourage you to communicate your wish list, I guess, as best we can, but also inform us, in a way of, it's great that you send us this information, but you know what, it would be much more beneficial if you could send it in a different way or communicate differently. Or these are the bits that we don't understand from a science perspective. And I get very frustrated with my own colleagues sometimes, not so much in the company because we try and avoid it, but you hear a lot of these things where they put policy groups together at government level or research funding or strategies. We convened an expert group. What they mean is they've got experts in genomics or they've got experts in science. So it's like, well, I'm yet to see anybody be more of an expert in a disorder than anybody who's suffering with it, because they're the real experts.
Yeah.
I think we have to start being truly patient-centric, and that means listening, and it means understanding what is it that we can do to help and what are we trying to solve. Because I think sometimes we don't listen enough. We just get in love with the science, and we see genomics come through and think it's going to solve everything. And who knows? Decades from now, it may well have solved a lot of things. But there is a here and now, and there's the more immediate term to say, well, what are we trying to solve today? So it's your passion, I guess, is what I'm looking for, and your ability to teach us.
Right. Any next person question? Anyone else?
I've put people on mute, so if you want to just unmute yourselves and ask a question, please feel free to go ahead. Thanks.
Lucy.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tony, for a very thought-provoking talk. As you say, I was fortunate enough to listen to the seminar this morning by your organisation. It was very interesting. And here is it Ross and Charlotte from Parkinson's Concierge. So I think their purpose is very interesting. That and I've not met this organisation before, but they essentially wanted companies to have more awareness of Parkinson's, so that to help employees, so that people could stay in work and be accommodating in work. So I think that's a very good ambition there. And I want to ask the rest of the group, I'm not sure how much Parkinson's UK do this, because perhaps Ross and Charlotte are doing this because Parkinson's UK, they feel are not doing enough. I don't know. But it seems
I think it's certainly feedback we've got is we get much more or many more approaches from other therapeutic areas. So we'll get a lot of approaches from some rare disease groups like black bone disease and rare disorders where they're patient focused and driven. We get many more approaches from Alzheimer's or dementia research, and yet we don't see very much of, or haven't done, of the Parkinson's community. And I don't know Parkinson's UK particularly well, which is possibly a failing on my part as well, that I haven't connected those dots. And then Russ and Charlotte came along and started educating me, I guess, which was part of this.
I looked on the Parkinson's Concierge website this morning, and the one thing I noticed was they didn't have Parkinson's UK as one of their partners.
Strange, isn't it?
And I actually wrote to them on their query thing and said, why don't you have Parkinson's UK on your list of partners? And I don't know, I mean, they haven't come back to me yet, but that would be interesting, because that's the biggest group. Parkinson's UK are the big funders. Just seems strange to me, that's all.
I mean, I say I'm not as familiar with Parkinson's UK as perhaps I should be, and I think it's one of those things that, where I have come across them, it's been in research conferences where the panel discussions or something have been around what's the latest research and what's happening. But I don't see them very much on, I guess what I see more of with Russ and Charlotte are those outreach things to say, well, can we talk to your employers about how people could be employed by them? I know for me, this was in a context of, with me working with companies, it's about how do we enable them to be the best employers they can be. And this was part of that conversation this morning, is like, where do we go from here to be better? And I haven't come across Parkinson's UK doing that. They may well do it. That's just under my radar or something.
Well, I think Ross and Charlotte sound great, and that a link with Parkinson's UK would be a benefit both ways, hopefully, to encourage them to do what they're doing.
I mean, I moderated a panel I was on the panel with both of them, actually, on one thing, talking about this being patient-centric. and again, I did reach out to, I think was it Steve? Wasn't Steve Ford? It was something like that.
Steve Ford is the I think he's just left the company now actually, but he was the
I did reach out, but I couldn't get any traction with Steve, and I thought at the time it was a bit of a shame, and I guess other things come up and you just lose momentum, I guess.
So just mention the other point that you said, I think sounds very interesting, is greater awareness from all the great range of companies you're involved with, all life sciences. They may have ways of interacting being useful for people with Parkinson's that they hadn't thought of because they didn't know enough about the conditions. So that range of, where we tend to think of Parkinson's and very narrow as a drug to, drug companies and making a pill, but there's going to be a whole range of other services and helpful things possibly through that range of companies. So I just think wonderful promoting awareness both ways would be good.
And that's the bit that sort of, like I say, it's, I guess, when Ruth asked you, like, what did I want from the group? I guess it's just input. It's kind of, we can't tell your story in the way that you can, as a group.
Just say, individuals. One other point though is I was interested. You used the word patient in there, whereas Parkinson's UK, I know, is sort of keen to promote talking about Parkinson's and not Parkinson's disease, and perhaps not thinking about people with Parkinson's as patients, but people living with Parkinson's. And actually, I find that useful to be thinking, well, it's people, it's like you and me, and there's a fine line between it could be me with Parkinson's. And I think because you've had that personal experience, your father and your other family members, it becomes more real. It could be any of us, seeing as not them, but all together. That's what I've learned.
Part of it, I think it's input like that to say, well, this is the messaging that would be much more useful. And actually the messaging sometimes actually covers how to be more welcomed, I guess. You can try to help, but if you're using messaging that people don't find as open and as welcoming as it could be, that part of the communication is lost, and it comes back to building that trust and rapport and engagement. And I think that sort of thing is really important, I think.
We have a question in the chat room from Christopher Paul, who said, you said earlier that you did some work at Genesis in Cambridge. Parkinson's UK have their research facility in Cambridge. Is there a possibility of linking with them, which presumably is the Roger Barker lab?
There's every possibility. We were aware of it. We've just failed every time we've reached out to engage them. And if anybody can give us a warmer introduction, I guess, then we would love to have them, as we have Anthony Nolan Trust and Cancer Research. I
think Lucy and I can do that. And maybe Janet as well.
Yeah, I think Parkinson's UK are doing a lot of this already. In terms of that, when grant applications go in, you need to consult with the people living with Parkinson's. So it seems to just be a bit of an extension of that into maybe the workplace. Would that be correct? Do you do more with the workplace rather than research?
Actually, to be fair, we work more with research companies than we do about the workplace. We work with them to bring their research together and then to find partners and academic collaborators, and they will, I'm sure many of the companies, if they're active in Parkinson's, they will be linking to the lab in Cambridge or a group because of the grant funding.
Yes.
So we're like a big, if you thought of us like a dating agency to some degree. So we bring these companies together that have different bits of the jigsaw. So they may well have a great a research facility to understand, from a genomic basis, what's a new therapeutic molecule they could target. They'll need to work with other people to come up with that new chemical entity and how to develop it. And our job is to try and put them into the same space to find each other.
Is that different to the virtual biotech company that Parkinson's UK has?
Yeah, again, they would be a typical, well, they are typical because they're virtual, but they would be a typical member, if you like. So we have lots of companies, virtual or physical, that do some of that. And then they need to find partners or investors or regulatory advisors or whatever to take it to the next step. So it's, it overlaps with that for sure.
Sometimes these things happen because it's just people just don't see each other. It's like just being in different corners of a room and you just don't get to meet. And it's not because they're not useful to each other. It's just because they just haven't got there yet.
And again, for me, it's that almost that serendipity bit, you know, if it, just meeting yourself and having this conversation may never have happened. You know, it's sort of, it was just a link through friends and relatives and awareness, and you get a chance to speak to a new group of people, and sometimes that's where the best ideas come from. You know, it's just a chance conversation, and you might have met somebody on the train, and these things happen. And I don't think there's anything that is saying, you know, I don't believe for a minute the lab in Cambridge doesn't like us or doesn't want to talk to us, or vice versa. It just hasn't happened, and anything that can help that happen, I would see as a positive thing, really.
Well, you're not in competition, are you?
No, not at all.
No.
Just in their defence, I think they're probably very busy clinicians and researchers, and not seeing themselves as companies. And so it's probably a time thing.
I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, for their limited bandwidth, a lot of the time engaging directly with a company that they're co-writing a grant application with or taking a trial forward, they quite rightly prioritize that rather than a One Nucleus. And it's just finding those touch points to say, well, what could we do that's useful? And maybe we end up doing, you know, we did a session this morning like that, but there's no reason why we wouldn't do a session maybe with them and do some session where they're presenting the science they're doing to our network and how people get involved, you know.
So what do you think that we could do for you, or vice versa, in practical terms?
In practical terms, I say I think any connections like that, I think, would be really helpful to try and move the conversation forward in one way or another, I guess, and knit things together. And I think kind of beyond that, I would love to maybe spend some more time, maybe, you know, catching up with some of you on when we're going to employers, or whether we're looking to engage back with, you know, a Parkinson's group, just sort of giving us some guidance on what, you know, what you would consider to be the best way, like I say, to communicate it. So not using the wrong phraseology for it or terminology. And, you know, what is it that, I guess in a sense is just educate us a bit on what the best way to communicate those messages are. In terms of the other way around, I'd love to see, you know, the chance, if you've got a news article or a blog or something that one of the group has been researching or been involved in that's really helpful. They're just really interesting human stories to put on our website or in the newsletters. That it's interesting when you get together with, you know, sometimes at events there can be thousands of us at the same event, of researchers and people supporting research and looking to translate it. The people who get the most attention when they speak is the patient. The patient up, it reminds everybody why they were in the industry in the first place, rather than chasing the next deal or dealing with a Monday morning issue. It just makes you stop and think, oh yeah, that's what we were trying to do. And I think for me, a part of One Nucleus is to bring that reminder on the shoulder of our members sometimes, you know, with all the stuff that goes on, don't lose sight of the end goal here. You know, yes, they compete for funding, yes, they compete for publications or compete for staff, but fundamentally they've all got the same end goal here, and that's improving patient lives.
I'm intrigued by the fact that you have emphasized the importance of people. As a member of Parkinson's UK and observing my wife with Parkinson's now for 15, 16 years, I hear from Parkinson's that there are so few people with Parkinson's disease, or the condition, that it doesn't make money for these businesses who are making the methods of managing these symptoms. Is there any way that you can encourage people? I realize they are not charities and they need to make a profit, but it would be, look at the coronavirus situation that we're in, and how they've applied so much research and things have moved extremely fast. It would be lovely if they could work that fast with Parkinson's.
Well, absolutely, I couldn't agree more with you. But I think there's always that element of some of this is a commercial step, and they're making investment decisions in that sense. But equally, I don't think it's not just driven by a commercial attitude either. And I think often there are things, and this is why the more they understand about the range of symptoms and the condition itself to come through and say, well, how could we intervene? Then, you know, it may be that they say, well, would we develop a brand new drug molecule $800 million, are we going to see a return? I think, to be honest with you, more and more it's the case that you know, obviously there are companies still researching that, they're just finding it very difficult. But I think the progress they're making now in understanding at a very sort of physiology and cellular level of what they can do, but also it's then a fact of it overlaps with other programs they're working on. So if you look at the progress on the vaccine, actually a lot of that came because they've been working on these technologies not for COVID but for something else, and they could switch it. So there may well be, in the same reason we saw decades ago when the new variant CJD thing was coming down the track and they thought that was going to be huge. It wasn't the fact that industry could switch resources to it, but they could look at what they were doing and say, well, can we apply this? I think, I don't know whether you engage at all with the Cambridge Rare Disease Network, and Parkinson's not being a rare condition in the sense of the way some of these guys look at it, where there's like 10 patients in the country or something. But I think there's more and more funding models and business models, which mean these companies can increasingly go towards a more and more targeted therapy and more precise. And, you know, I fully get the frustrations and the feelings for some to say, well, it's not a big enough market. And I think, you know, I would have thought that myself, I guess, years ago, the big pharma companies that we see in the shop windows, if it wasn't a big enough market, they weren't spending money on it. Whereas actually we've seen that fragment quite a lot. And I think that's changing a lot. And that's, like, if you like, could be a benefit of doing more with your group, is to get that dialogue to happen, so that at the very least what they can do is communicate what they are doing and what is driving their decisions, and are they truly putting Parkinson's people at the center of that decision making.
I have to ask the question. As a mere branch of Parkinson's UK, will the farmers take any notice of us?
I think it's one of these things that, and again, it's a bit like, sort of, will the big pharma company take any notice? You know, there are the very visible, very large pharma companies like AstraZeneca and GSK and Pfizer and similar. But if you think of a lot of the innovation and new ideas coming through come from much smaller companies and that are private, just out of academia and university often. So they do engage at a very local level quite often, and they're as interested in people as they are in their research. They're interested in their research because it's linked to people. And I just think I'd like to think anyway, we're getting better as an industry of being much more responsive to the people side of what we do. So, you know, I think I take the point. I think it's, why has there not been such progress in Parkinson's as there has been on the vaccine, or even in some of the cancer treatment areas? And again, I think if we looked at where funding was going, whether it's from public bodies and government bodies or from the private sector, you know, not enough goes into the neuro field, whether it's Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or anything. It's actually minuscule compared, not minuscule, it's very small compared to what goes into cancer research, for instance. And I don't think it's just the financial model of it. I think it's the difficult nature of the disorder in terms of understanding it from how to create new treatments. You know, it must have been 20 years ago, and I sat in the audience for Michael J. Fox to give a talk over in the States, or it must have been at least 10 years ago. And you know, he stood up on stage. He'd been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and he looked at this room full of people from around the globe in the pharma and biotechnology industry, and said, "Look, I'm rich enough to afford any drugs anyone can develop. I'm taking what they tell me is the best drug, and it was invented 40 years ago." And he looked at the room, and so I just have the question, which actually comes back to the point just made. He looked at the room and said, "So what the hell have you guys been doing?" You know, and again, it's one of those things that resonates. And I think, you know, coming back to that, how do we get more focus? How do we get companies to understand that there is a route to creating better outcomes? And it isn't a case of they can't do it, it's maybe they haven't found the way to do it yet. They can not just create the technology and the drug to do it, but have they found the way to do it in a way that they can afford to do it and attract the money to do it? And I think that's getting closer and closer as we get into this era they now call precision medicine. But I fully accept the frustrations if you were on looking at them and saying, well, why are these guys not making the progress that we've seen with the likes of COVID-19, which has been quite remarkable, actually.
Right. Well, I've kind of monopolised, Tony. Is it anybody else got any questions, really?
So you're sort of instead of repurposing drugs, you're repurposing the technology.
Yeah.
If you have a really ill, to cure Parkinson's, please.
I mean, there's a company actually in Cambridge called Helix Therapeutics, and their sole focus, they're based on genomics, but what they do is look at approved medicines and they identify where the therapeutic targets might be from their genomic studies. And their business model is to repurpose known drugs because that's a much more affordable way that they can do it without requiring the investment the pharma companies aren't putting in. But again, I'm not aware of whether they are talking to Parkinson's or not. If they're not, I guess I would sit here and ask the question. Another question I have is why not? And if there's something we can catalyze that means that those conversations happen, then that's a win for me out of this.
I think the medical community itself has trouble understanding Parkinson's, so we can understand why the technology companies have problems.
And I think that is a really big challenge. And I think it's probably because, as I've recently learned, there's this wide variety of symptoms of Parkinson's. So it's kind of defining what it is they're trying to address. And it's a very complex disorder, clearly, from a molecular level. Otherwise, they would have made more progress. I've got no doubt.
I think I'd agree with that. I think we're taught, and I'm coming back to I did physiology and psychology degree in neuroscience. We're taught dopamine is loss of, Parkinson's is loss of dopamine, and there's these 3 core symptoms, and that's sort of what you learn, and the drugs to treat that. And of course, it's only now I appreciate it's far more complicated, more varied than that, with other factors going on. But perhaps it's been a bit too narrow. And then when alpha-synuclein was discovered, all the money went there again. So sometimes it's been a bit narrow, I think, and not prepared to look wider.
Yeah, and it does happen. It's even if you look at Alzheimer's research, which gets a lot of funding put into it, and like the alpha-synuclein, but they found the beta amyloid theory of dementia, and everything went into that, and actually it didn't work. Fundamentally, it's not paid off. And so again, there is a bit of a herd mentality as well. If someone thinks, oh, that's going to work, we should go after it. We don't want to be left out, if you like, if you're in a competitive field. But again, I think for me, it comes down to more awareness we can raise, because it's always difficult to tell. It always happens because of people at the end of the day, and it's a conversation with 2 people who say, oh, actually, we've got something that might be worth looking at with this. And and you'll see technologies coming out of other uses to say, I've even seen a discussion today about virtual reality being used this was in dementia. But it was about just how do you improve? It's not all about chemicals. It can be technologies.
I'm now conscious that we're moving towards 8 o'clock, and I'm going to ask one more. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I have monopolised you, but I'm going to ask, what can we do? What would you like us to do?
I think
let's put you on the spot.
For me out of this, one has been if someone could introduce me to the Cambridge lab, because I'd love to have a discussion with them.
We can do that. Yeah.
I'll go back and try and find out from Russ and Charlotte as to why Parkinson's UK isn't as one of their partners. I do know they speak, so I don't know what the relationship is with that. But I think that would make sense. And the other thing is I'd love to come back to you and see whether we could put together some form of event with some of our members to say, well, can we replay these sorts of discussions, but with an audience from my side of the fence? Builds a bit on this morning session, a bit on this. Actually, what more can we do to engage between the focus groups and the industry?
Well, should we have a conversation, maybe not here, but about what we could do? Is that okay, folks? Would you like that? Just to see what we can do. Maybe have a little mini conference to talk to people about what we want. rather than what they're going to give us, if you see what I mean. You know, so
I always think some of those things, and I always encourage people with, you know, I always think, ask sort of telling us what it is you would like, you know, what would be useful. I always think it's a bit like writing a Christmas list. So be specific. If you're not specific enough, I might get it wrong.
So maybe that's what we'll take. I mean, that's what I think that would be useful. But I'm only one person, and I think. But if we could get to people, however small, it's you know, acorns and oak trees. If you can plant a seed, then maybe it will grow into something.
Yeah,
who knows?
Sometimes you find that champion who can go on and change things. You know,
Yeah.
I think it's about the connections.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, are there any other questions for Tony? Oh, Janet, Aubrey, got a finger up.
I've been intrigued to hear what you're doing, and how what you're doing in your area seems to be parallel to something that Parkinson's UK has had a project for the last 5 years to establish an excellence network throughout the country, so that wherever you are, if you've got Parkinson's, you get good treatment. The fact is, you go into one hospital and you are treated abysmally because nobody knows what's wrong with you. In another hospital, you go in and they know exactly what to do and they treat you very well. Intriguing that you're doing something similar.
So I guess, you know, because we don't have a focus on Parkinson's, I guess, so we touch upon lots of things. So we're kind of generalists to a large degree and non-experts, as opposed to the Parkinson's guys who can build this sort of network of excellence and so forth. And they, you know, I would more than happily promote that if it meant the message was getting to more of the hospitals to say, you know, please go and be part of this and get a level of treatment to the point where it's considered. I guess, you know, that's part of the reason that the NHS has nice and things to get to standard care plans. But I'm just a great believer in the fact that the more you can get people to talk and engage, the more momentum those sorts of things get. And ultimately what you hope at the end of it is that you do move away from that, sometimes a lottery of, have I walked into the right hospital?
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I've got a lovely note from Christopher Paul, who says, thanks for a really interesting talk, especially on how you could link PUK research and development for others. So I think if that's okay, I'm going to kind of wind it up now. And thank you, Tony. And I think we should all talk together.
I think I always think talking is the first step to solving anything. So
yeah. So I mean, if that's okay, I'll say thank you. And can we thank them? It's ridiculous saying thank you. You're all clapping. Virtual clapping.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I hope it was interesting enough, and we can.
I think it was. I mean, it's conceptual, but really interesting. And I think, personally, I think that if we can talk to people and maybe have a little mini conference or do something. I mean, Lucy would maybe be able to help or whatever, but maybe we should talk, if that's okay.
Yeah, good for me.
Is that okay?
Excellent.
Well, I'm going to say thank you again. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And we'll speak again.
Yeah. Okay. Bye now.
Thanks, Tony. All the best. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everybody. Can I just thank all those who came in from elsewhere outside? I mean, Christopher Poole from Chelmsford, absolutely delighted to see you with us, Christopher, from over in Essex there. And Pam Skeggs and various other people who've come and joined us, our branch. It's an absolute delight to see you. Do please continue and come and see us when we have another meeting. And thanks for Ruth for putting together and getting an exciting speaker with such as Tony. Tony, many thanks.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah. We will all talk together.
Okay.
Have a lovely communication.
I'm going to say goodbye. Cheers,
okay.
El.